week so that we have a free time next week, and then planning for the holidays. So I know it's crazy out there, but thank you so much for joining. As I mentioned, this is an associate with the Rennie Center. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I do not care which one you use. I love both equally. Thank you so much for joining. As we get started, I wanted to start us off, Michelle, feel free to move on to the next slide, by getting us thinking and getting our juices flowing. I know we're coming from different spaces, different headspaces, but would love it if you could just share in the chat what educator-led SEL practices have inspired you in your practice. So this could be something that you saw from a colleague, something that you've learned in a different PD, something that you yourself have just, found really useful in the classroom. And the reason I ask this is not only to get us thinking and get our juices flowing, but also because I feel really strongly that we should be sharing our best practices together, that we as educators should be coming together in these spaces and allowing our amazing skills that we all bring to be shared with one another. So definitely want to have the space be useful and for folks to leave with essential tactics that they can then bring into the classroom. So please, when you get a chance, please add your thoughts to the chat, and we'll give you about 2 minutes to do that. Kevin says responsive classroom practices, PK through 6th grade. Teachers asking students to share hopes and dreams for the school year. That's wonderful and very much needed in this time and space lately. Sarah says we're using High Five out of Vermont. They have 3 courses that all have activities: rebuilding community, rebuilding while building, and rebuilding physicality. I love that. Morning meeting, circles, being welcoming and affirmative environment, celebrating students, birthdays, huge now that we have been virtual and a lot of students didn't get to celebrate their birthday with peers last year. And also every day is a thankful day to have woken up, right? Great. Self-regulating music. Oh, love that. Rest, walks, all that good stuff. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate that. Great. Thank you so much. So our agenda for today, Michelle, if you can move to the next slide, is around, we're going to do a quick introduction. We're going to also cover an overview of the action guide that our initiative, the ExSEL network, created over the course of the past couple of years. This is a tangible evergreen resource for you all to use, and we're going to dive into that and answer any questions you have about it. We're specifically going to dive deep into student voice and agency and how to cultivate that. We're going to have someone from the field, the amazing Jessica Lander, share her wonderful work with her students in the classroom, how we build from the small activities that we do in the classroom to larger projects that we do outside from the classroom to the school to the city level and the larger community at large. We're going to share final resources and then we're going to wrap up. We are a small group today, so I want to encourage you to ask your questions, put them in the chat. There's the little emoji button that you can also click if you want, if you would prefer to raise your hand and speak out loud. We want this to be interactive. We want this to be a useful resource for you, and we want you to get out of it what you sought to get out of it. Yes. So introduction. So I've already mentioned my name, Ellie. I'm not going to repeat that again. But I also wanted to shout out my fabulous team doing this ExSEL work. Michelle Field, who is a director of programming at the Rennie Center, and Annalisa Buzaid, who is our research director, both in the audience, and Michelle is also helping me out with the slides. Thank you so much, Michelle, and recording. And for those who are not familiar with work at the Rennie Center, the Rennie Center is a data-driven organization that utilizes a variety of ways to support educators in making well-informed decisions about policy and practice in education. And so a huge example of this is which a variety of districts and a variety of educators. And then our work, our impact lies in sharing and creating access to folks to be aware of these best practices and to apply them as well. So a little bit more about the ExSEL network. If you go to the next slide, Michelle, is that the ExSEL network came out of districts, and together these districts tested out different practices around SEL, but also around.
We'll be coming back up momentarily.
Oh, here we are. Sorry about that, everyone. I'm sure you can all, you've all been there. Good and but I can just keep going with the presentation. We briefly will put it. This was largely led by the work we do is run by educators and is really led by educators that by committees, by superintendents, by leaders. I'm just tagging y'all. Welcome to SEL 101. Oh, we've lost everyone. Okay, great. I'm going to share the action guide. That is where I was going to take us next anyway. So I'm going to add it to the chat so you can all see it. Ooh, we're back on. Thank you so much, team. I've added the link to the action guide. And so the action guide came out of the work that the ExSEL network created in the conversations around best practices around SEL, around the different guides that folks were implementing in their schools to purposely around their student population. And so this was created to make sure that these practices were shared with the larger landscape of Massachusetts public school districts. So I'm just going to dive deep in here, and you're welcome to just take a look at the link that I just sent and look through it yourself, or I'm also going to walk through it very quickly because it's a long guide. You don't want me talking about it all day, and we only have an hour to show you how we use this guide. So Michelle, if you could take us through to the website, that would be great. And the biggest pieces around the action guide are threefold. So step one is building an SEL team. We all know that in our districts, in our schools, we've seen when one person takes on an initiative, whether it's an educator, whether it's an administrator, whether it's a social worker, if that one person is the only one person doing the work, it's not going to get done and it's not going to get administered through the entire school. So you really want to build a team. And then next, you want to set a vision and create goals around that team. Because if we don't have a vision, then we're not going to get anywhere. And if we don't have the goals and the steps, then that's really not going to work. And then lastly is taking action on that vision and setting those goals. So as you can see here on the website, we have these three different buckets split up. So you can see the initial, how to use this guide, what is SEL, getting started, so building the team, setting a vision and goals, and different SEL strategies for how you can take on action. So if we go to the first bucket around building a team, and we click on build a committed SEL team. We click on that. It will take you straight to that guide. And if you go down, you'll see different steps that it takes. So who you want to be a part of that team, you want an administrator, you want educators, you want students. I highly recommend having students on your SEL team if that is something that's feasible. Having parents and community members part of that team is really essential as well. And then it also takes you through how do you make sure that the communication is there, the norms are set, different identity roles that you can set up. And it really is a step-by-step guide of how to do this. One of my favorite pieces, if we keep scrolling down and moving forward, is around, so sometimes it's really useful to have the step-by-step guide and being able to implement it. The different activities are really great. But I also often want to see how other schools are implementing this, right? Because it's not real until you've seen somebody else do it and seen how effective it has been, what are the challenges and the successes. So if you keep scrolling all the way down, there are lessons from the field. And you could also go to the sidebar and you can see the different districts that have already implemented SEL teams and how they went about it, hear different stories. And I find this really helpful. They even tell you like who was part of the team, how did they get them on board, who took on what. And I find that really essential. We have data practices there, we have different activities, all the good stuff. And it's even a checklist. So you can go off if you've already created and check it off once you've already completed your team, completed the checklist. And it feels, I don't know about you, but it really feels great when I check off things on my to-do list. I think that feels like it gets me going. So that's just an example of one of the buckets we have there. Obviously, there's more that we can dive in deeper. If we go down to the taking action piece, you can see that there are different strategies around authentic relationship building, student identity, different pieces like that. Today, we're going to focus on the student voice and agency piece. So we're going to dive deeper into that. But before I move on, are there any questions about the site, the resources on there, how to use it effectively, anything like that? Feel free to unmute, feel free to chat. No? All right. Well, we can go back to the presentation. Thank you so much, Michelle, for doing that. Great. So we're going to dive deeper into student voice and agency. And so the three buckets that really get highlighted within the website and in the SEL work that we've discussed throughout the ExSEL network is how we can build SEL practices and how we can really uplift our students and allow them to have voice and agency in the classroom is one space. How is our pedagogy really ensuring that our students can advocate for their own learning, can express themselves, can bring their full on identities into the classroom with them, and thinking about those steps. The second is at the school level, right? How are we making sure that not just in our classroom, not just our classroom being that safe space, but also how do we make sure that we're bringing in administrators who maybe are more hesitant to hear students vocalize their concerns about the school. One of the most common issues that students bring up is dress code, right? And so it's one thing to say, we're not going to discuss that. We're not going to, we don't have any voice in this, but it's another to let's have a conversation around why is a dress code at the school a thing? Why do we have this rule? And how can we perhaps build consensus, perhaps have a conversation, perhaps just allow students to voice their concerns in a respectful, professional way and allow them to feel heard at their own school and in their community, right? this is how we go from classroom to school level to community. And then the last one is, and the larger piece is, how do we get students to feel this way, not just in our classroom, not just at the school, but at the community level? Where are the assets to the community? What do they want to see more of in their community? Where are there maybe, where are the changes that they would like to see? And how can they be a part of that change? So those are the three big pieces that we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to talk about an example from my previous work around how I got students to engage within the community. So Michelle, if you can go on to the next slide. This is one of my favorite moments, but what I neglected to mention at the beginning is that previously I supported educators and coached educators in implementing an action civics curriculum that allowed students to advocate and learn about government through actually taking action in their communities, at their schools, at the state level and beyond. And it was a really wonderful way to see 12, 13, 16-year-olds realize that they didn't just have to watch the community challenges that they were facing and that their families were facing. They could actually take action on it. And so this example is from a Boston public school, but it's a Boston Globe article. They made it, they made it on there. And these students are 12 and 13 years old. The issue they were working on was that if you're familiar with the geography of Boston, you might be familiar with Melnia Cass, and a big point in the community where there's a huge opioid crisis, obviously throughout the state, but specifically in Boston, that is where a lot of folks who are dealing with the trauma of the opioid crisis stay and hang out. And this impacts these students because their school lies right on that line. And so they often come to school with needles on the sidewalks, with needles in the backyard, on the baseball fields, and they felt like this needed to be addressed by their city and their school. And so they held a panel where they actually had city councilors on there. City councilor Anissa Slaby George came to that panel. Legislator Byron Rushing came to that panel, and other community organizations joined that panel. And it was really an effective way to show these students that their voice mattered, that their care for the community mattered, and that they could speak up and do something about the neighborhood that they care so much about and the school that they cared so much about. So this is a big picture thing, right? You're not going to go from the first day of school, we're doing this project, we're going to do posters, and we're going to get this panel of legislators. This is a big picture thing that maybe you move towards the end of the year and think about, what do these larger projects look like to lift up my students' voices? But there are smaller things that we do every day in the classroom to build authentic relationships, to make sure that our students feel important in the classroom, that we can do. And that is really what SEL is about. So without further ado, I would love to have our amazing guest speaker come on, and she's going to share more about not just these larger picture ways of how we uplift our students, but these smaller pieces that we can do in our classroom, and even set the environment in our classroom to allow for student voice and agency to happen. So with us today, we have Jessica Lander, who is an educator in Massachusetts. She teaches history and civics to recent immigrant students in Massachusetts, and has won several awards. Most recently, she was named the top 50 finalists for the Global Teacher Prize presented by the Varkey Foundation. Jessica writes frequently about education policy and teaching. She is a co-author of Powerful Partnerships, A Teacher's Guide to Engaging Families for Student Success, and author of Driving Backwards. In 2019, Jessica and 14 of her former students launched the National We Are America project, working with teachers across the country to support more than 1,500 students to share their stories of American identity. Jessica is a Reimagining Migration Fellow and she served as a 2019-2020 Emerson Collective Fellow. She's currently working on her third book, Making Americans, which I'm sure she's happy to talk to any of you about, and exploring best strategies, programs in schools, and policies supporting immigrant origin children in the United States. So thank you so much, Jessica, for joining us, and feel free to take it away.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ellie. And it's just wonderful to be in community with all of you today. Ellie and I go way back. I first got to learn with her at Generation Citizen, and I'll talk some about the work that my students have done with Ellie's former organization. But it's really exciting. Ellie reached out a couple of weeks ago saying, would you be willing to talk with teachers and learn with teachers? And I, of course, said yes. So I'm hoping that the next 20, 15 minutes can be more of a conversation that I, as an educator, and I know for all of you, like talking at people is less productive. And so I don't want to just like tell you lots of things, but would love to be in community with you. And so Ellie and I were thinking that if you want to like share questions in the chat, and then I'll sort of pause and we can like have that conversation. If you want to raise your hand with the little hand emojis in the Zoom reactions. But basically, I'm here to sort of share a few things of my practice, to talk about SEL in my classroom, from building on what Ellie said of those really powerful and amazing projects that we've seen students do, particularly around action civics and student voice, and how do we get to there, because it doesn't happen, as Ellie said, day one. And so how do we build those classroom cultures and communities? And it was really powerful to read in the chat some of the things that you all shared at the beginning of the workshop of practices that you're bringing into your classrooms. And I think a lot of my practice has really been from exactly this, of like listening to other people and being like, oh, such a cool idea, or visiting other classrooms and being like, oh, how can I replicate this in my classroom? So I wanted to start off with just talking about some of the practices I have in my classroom that try to build a culture and community in my class that then lets us do the type of work that Ellie was talking about. And so this is, welcome to my classroom. I teach in Lowell High School. I teach about 150 mostly recent immigrants and refugees from across the world, teaching high school history and civics. And my classroom this year is actually totally redesigned. Ellie mentioned this book that I'm writing. So I've been traveling around the country pre-COVID, looking at innovative schools across the country, working with immigrant origin students, and pulled some best practice that I saw and infused it into my classroom. So I was just going to share a few parts of that, of ways that I'm trying to create space for my kiddos. And so one of them that I wanted to talk about was the Calm Corner, which you see in the big picture. It's the tree that's not actually a real tree, but I did try to convince some of my kids that the plants just grew up really big. That's over in the corner. And then Ellie, if we go to the next slide, we get to zoom in on that. Basically, the Calm Corner was a space for me in my classroom to provide a place for kids to reset for themselves, to provide a calm space for kids who either were maybe a little less focused or upset about something, to still be in the classroom, still be learning with us and in community with us, but maybe have a space that maybe they were less distracted or didn't want to be sitting with their friends at that time. And so it's like slightly turned away, but still present. There's a whole bunch of strategies that I pulled from classrooms I saw. One is, of course, the plants. And so drawing on research around trauma therapy. And so there's a lot of herbaceous plants that are from all around the world that my kids will recognize. And so just that tactile, that smelling, that those sort of soothing scents. There is a yellow box filled with fidget toys, which honestly is one of the most used things in my classroom every day. One of my classes literally just takes that yellow box out, and every single kid is like squishing or popping or something the entire class. And there's a whole bunch of them in there, and they're different colors, and they're different types of squishes, and they're not loud squishes. But just like small things of like, adults need this too, kids need this, of just things to do with your hands to then be able to focus on our learning together. That tree in the corner is pillows that look like trees. And so we are trying to, yes, I teach high school, but why shouldn't we sit on the floor, and why shouldn't we have different types of creative spaces? And so using our pillows as much as possible and getting out of desks. And just this space, and there are other elements in the Calm Corner, but as being a focusing space for kids for different reasons why they might have it. And I've had it, kids self-advocate to use it when they're feeling a little distracted, and they just sit there, they're not looking at their friends. So they're maybe not presenting or performing to their friends, and they're able to focus on work. I've had kids who are really upset. I had a kid yesterday who had had a family member pass away. And just wanted to be in that space, just a little bit more removed, but still present in the class. And so just thinking about, these are best practices I saw elsewhere, and trying to bring them into my classroom of ways to, particularly for our kiddos who might be struggling in a whole bunch of different ways, or maybe not just totally focused on learning, which, you know, all of us are at certain points, to still be present in the class, and also to sort of just show that we care, and to also help build strategies for them of how do they refocus or recenter. So that's just one small thing that I do. And I wanted to build on that, of thinking about how we then create sort of those opportunities, as Ellie was talking about, for voice. And of course, I'll just pause too, of just like reminding, if you have questions, or if you want to be like, I want more explanation, please like throw a hand up or throw something in the chat. I'm happy to sort of just pause and answer questions. But what I'm trying to do in my class is really very quickly early on is do a lot of signaling, which I assume is true of all of your classrooms as well. Of I hope my kids feel and know that I care about them, and this is a space where they can be courageous, and that they can come ask for help. And it's a space where they're going to feel accepted, whether they're having a great day or a not great day. And there's a lot of building in this. There's like weekly check-ins that I do on Google Forms, and this then leads to lots of individual check-ins. And that then creates the trust that allows us to do some of the work later on. And I see a great question, so I'm going to pause and actually answer that question, because I think it's really powerful. How many students can be in the Calm Corner at once? 1, 2. So that's a really fantastic question. If it was a space in a school, I've seen it done really powerfully while there are multiple kids in that space, because it might be a whole room, and there's an adult in that space with them, and they're each using a part of it. When it's in my classroom, it's usually like 1 student at a time. And there are ways I've thought about doing it. I have like little like sand timers. So if there were 2 kids who really needed it, maybe going like, take 5 minutes. And we haven't actually needed that in the classroom yet, but the idea could be like, you, again, this is sort of like you taking that independence and that agency of going, I'm going to be here for a certain amount of time, and then I'm going to let another student use the space. And so those are suggestions that I've seen, or strategies I've seen. But that would be different if you had a whole room to work with, and it wasn't also being a classroom at the same time, and you weren't also instructing. And the other really great question on this is, do you suggest to students that they use, or independent self-selection? Both. So I've had a student who came in, very clearly had been crying, talked with her outside, didn't want to talk about what was going on, which is totally fine. And instead of going, okay, well, you're all weepy, go sit down in your class and learn, suggested she sit over in the Calm Corner, and gave her a stress ball and showed her all of the different scents. It was early in the year. And by like 20 minutes in, she was focused and had self-directed for herself to get on and do the work. And she sat quietly doing the work from that space, slightly turned away, but still totally present. She could do all the work. We have computers now, one-to-one, yay pandemic. And the next day she came in and shared with me a note and shared some personal things and did some explaining, and that then led to a conversation, and that led to us being like, well, whenever you feel this way, go to this space. This is your space. I've also had other kids who are a little bit more rambunctious one day, just be like, I'm gonna sit here. And you're like, great, you do that. So it's both. I definitely will suggest it sometime for a kid, either both because they might be upset or because they're a little bit distracted, and go, let's just like take away some of the distractions of your friends. So you're even just visually not seeing them. And you're looking at some calm words and some plants. So both work. Refusal, I mean, like, it's their choice too. So someone asked, what if a student refuses? It's not a place that I'm going to be like, you must sit there, because this is not a room where you're like, this is punishment. It's the opposite of punishment. So it's really choices, and I'm creating space of this might be helpful. And so it's a lot about tone, of here's the space and use it if you want. And never really had a kid not want to go sit there. But these are great questions. Please send more if you have them. I do want to talk a little bit more about a student voice, and move to elevating voice to build that trust. And so what if where each of my students are all immigrant origin students. They translate it into English. They have to get it from mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle. Maybe they write it. They cook this themselves. They translate it. We work on the editing. And then they also tell a story of self, a story of what that food means to their family, what their memories are of that food, why it's important in their country, or perhaps it's in their religion. And then a little bit of their migration journey to the United States. And creating, really, this is one of our first, they all build on each other, but like creating, it's a small 3-paragraph opportunity to share a little bit about you, to share something that's important to you, and to really demonstrate to the kids that it has value in our classroom, it has value in the history that we study, and it has value in our community. We sell the cookbook in our school and in our community, and the kids all bring in food, and we get to try each other's food, which is also really powerful. And who doesn't love food? So here are a few pictures from our last year's cookbook, and one of the pages, the spreads, and one of my students this year, I'm just finishing up editing the cookbook, and we're sending it to press next week. And then we build on that, and we think sort of more towards what Ellie was talking about with Action Civics work of thinking about student voice in terms of creating change. So we've worked on editing intensely. I mean, the cookbook goes through 10 rounds of edits. And we then moved to writing op-eds. And so the op-ed project is actually pulled from a graduate school class that I took, where a professor asked us to write an op-ed, and I realized it was like one of the first times I'd been asked to do work for a class that had meaning outside of the class. And I think that's really important for our kiddos, that we are not just asking them to do work that stays internal to the two of us, but that can have impact outside. And so each kid learns how to write an op-ed. They're 450 words. We edit. And then the Lowell Sun has been incredible and has published our op-eds, 10 of the top op-eds each year in the full page spread. And so again, ways of elevating student voice through long-term projects that take a lot of iteration, and creating opportunities for kids to tackle and share about things that they really care about. So each of them is choosing an op-ed on a topic that they care about as we learn how to write an op-ed. And we go from that to our action civics work. And that's our second semester, where we are doing work sort of like what Ellie was talking about, where we tackle together a community project for an entire semester. But we've done this smaller work, we've done iterative work, we've had students take lead in these ways in the fall, that by the spring, we've built this community where we're able to tackle the messy work of trying to create real systemic change, which is hard and very messy. But we're able to do that because we've built up throughout both building the trust one-on-one with students and building the trust together and building that community. And just like Ellie's students, my students have tackled really, really important issues, from Islamophobia to anti-Asian hate, to digital literacy divides, to I'll talk about this as a profile, food insecurity. And just to give an example of one project that we did that I'm really proud of is back a couple years ago, 4 years ago now, some of my students in one of my classes said, you know, an issue that we really care about is food insecurity. Some of our classmates don't have enough food. Some of my students had experienced food insecurity in their lives. And they reached out to the local food pantries and to the local food bank, and they did research, and they decided that they wanted to try to open up a school-based food pantry. And there was this wonderful moment where my students were like, Ms. Lander, can I use your classroom after school? The food bank is coming in for a meeting. And I was like, yes, absolutely. And thank you for doing that, taking that initiative on your own. Like, it was really, really incredible. They had those meetings, and they had more meetings, and they wrote a 23-page report that they presented to the school with a cost analysis and a location analysis and a partner proposal. And then the following fall, they opened up a food pantry in our school. It was one of, at the time, only a handful in the state. At the time, it was called Mill Market. So the picture on the left is of two of the founding members and members of that class, both and Rebecca. And this year, this fall, there's both a positive and a sad part of the story is really at about like within a day of each other, I learned that this amazing, amazing student I had, Rebecca, had passed away of health complications, and quite suddenly, and she was studying to become a nurse, and she's just an absolutely incredible human, joyous leader in our community. And then about a day later, I learned that the Mill Market was going to be expanded across the district, that people in the district had been so impressed with what we were doing and what the students had done. This was student-led and student-created and student-designed, that they wanted to replicate it in schools across the district. And so we rededicated our Mill Market in honor of Rebecca. So it's now Rebecca's Mill Market, and there are now about 5 across the district. There's going to be more in different schools. And so it's just the power of what student voice can do. And of course, as Ellie said, like, this isn't day one. This took months and months and months. And indeed, the really lasting impact of it has not been felt for, it took 4 years to feel that impact of it going across an entire district. But it's really, really powerful. Just very briefly, one of the other ways that I'm really proud of my students and how they are sharing their voices is a lot of our work is centered on, as I said, sort of doing work that extends outside of our community and outside of our classroom. And so we write a lot of books in our class. So you see up top the tasting history books, which is our cookbooks. And then I teach a seminar class looking at the history of diversity in America. And in that class, we have published books as well that we have then sent out to schools across the country. And I'll just close with, because I really want to create time for questions or conversation, is the We Are America project, which Ellie talked a little bit about, which is a project that started in my classroom in 2018, where some of my students felt that either they felt they counted as American, whether they've been in the country for generations or had recently come, or some of them didn't feel like they counted, or if they felt they counted, some felt that they didn't feel others felt they counted. And so we tried to grapple with what it meant to be American, with the idea and the understanding that every generation gets to redefine and expand what it means. My students wrote stories of self that they then published in a book. And then, and I think this for me is such a beautiful illustration of the power of student voice, is at the end of the year, we had spoken a number of universities. They came to me in the last days of school going, we really don't want this work to end. And the semester was ending, and like many of them were graduating, and they go, we don't want this to end. And so we mapped out on the whiteboard, one of the last days of school, a plan for what we would do to create a national project. And they were all in, and that was back in 2019. We founded the National We Are America project, and we sent out a call to teachers across the country. We built out the curriculum, and my students started mentoring teachers. And each of those classes worked using our curriculum to have their kids tell stories of self, to grapple with and expand what it means to be American. And each of those classes are publishing books, and we're now in our third cohort. And I get to work with my former students. And I've been working with them for the last 3 years, which is the most magical thing. So there's a couple of them in the picture on the screen. But I think it's just a really powerful example of student voice, of both students taking on a project, really feeling that it needs to have impact outside of the classroom, creating something that they're doing not for credit, not for a grade, not for money, that they just believe that it matters. And then also creating space for other students to have voice and to share their voice publicly. So I'm going to stop there. I've thrown a lot at you. I've talked way too much. I would love to answer questions or be in conversation with you, or Ellie might have other things that she wants to talk about, but these are just a few ways that I try to build up space for our kids to feel safe, valued, to be able to have courageous conversations with each other, and then be able to share their wisdom with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica. I really appreciate, I call you Jess, so Jessica feels weird to me, but Jess, thank you so much. I just love hearing the ins and outs of the amazing work that you do with your students. I myself am really close with a lot of Jess's students, so this, Rebecca being one of them. So the work that Jessica does is really meaningful to me, and I know for a fact that it's really meaningful to her students. So I just want to thank her for her time. I also wanted to, we have a few minutes available, and I want to make sure that you all get any questions, any answers you have to any of the questions you have. So please feel free to come off mute. I know folks are driving and you're listening in, but if you want to come off mute, if you want to add to the chat, we would love to answer any and all questions that you have for Jessica or for myself around the action guide. You have a lot of fans, Jess. Ralph and Mary, thank you both for your awesome comments here.
Really, I'm happy to answer anything. Parents play. Oh my gosh, parents are so important. Yay. I mean, I could talk so much, and Ellie could too, on the importance of family engagement. I'm happy to share. And maybe Ellie, could you put in the chat powerful partnerships? So I had the honor of working with Dr. Karen Mapp and Eileen Carver to write powerful partnerships about family engagement. And yeah, family engagement is central to any of the work we do as educators. It needs to be collaborative and equal partnerships, and there is not enough good training on family engagement and real powerful family engagement, and schools often don't yet create the time for teachers to do that and to invest in that work. But yeah, my families are like my key partners in supporting kids. I mean, I'm literally so all my parents have me on text using an app called Remind. And during this call, a couple parents have been texting me, and we're in conversation and supporting their kiddos in a whole bunch of different ways. I had a parent call me yesterday morning, this morning, they all merged together, talking about a health question he had about his kid. Like all of that work with families translates into the work I do in the classroom. And so I think the key thing is investing in real family engagement, ones that honor and truly collaborate with families, and recognizing that there's a lot of hierarchy built into schools. And so it's the role of the teachers and educators in schools to be breaking that down, and really trying to reposition and recreate relationships so that they're equal, and they're two-way and they're full-on partnerships. But it's essential to the work we do in SEL. Other questions? I'm not that scary, or hopefully not that scary. For those who are interested in learning more about the books, I'll put in the chat a link to part of my website that highlights some of the work I've done with students in book writing, and you can explore different parts of them. But I saw a thing about the cookbook is listed there, and so if you want to explore more. Other questions or shares of things that you're doing in your classroom around SEL?
Jess, I was also wondering if you were, oh, did somebody come off mute? No. Okay. I also was wondering if you could share, I remember you mentioning that you did like emoji of how you're feeling today, or checking that in. And I was wondering if you can share more about how that works and you know, your students' perspective on that activity.
Yeah, absolutely. This partially comes out of the research I did while traveling to do research for my book, is in one school in particular, learning and sort of thinking more about emotional vocabulary, that a lot of adults and a lot of kiddos don't have a wide emotional vocabulary. How are you doing? I'm doing good. Good is not an emotion. And so really trying to help build our students' emotional vocabulary. And during the pandemic, this was like particularly important for me to figure out a way to check in with my kiddos, because when they're in the room, you can get a sense from just their body language of how they're doing. Sometimes, not always, but more often. And suddenly I had none of those cues to go, how are you doing? And so I created a weekly check-in built on best practice I'd seen while traveling the country, that basically it's very simple. It has a series of emojis and it has a series of emotional words like I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm sick, or I'm feeling silly, or there's a series of them and they have funny emojis on them. And each Monday, my kids fill that in. They have to answer to, is there anything you want to share? Is there anything you're looking forward to this week? And I then review all of these. They come in through a Google form. It takes my kids maybe a minute, maybe 3 or 4. But it's huge for my practice. I did it during the pandemic, and it was one of the most important ways I was able to connect with my kiddos in not seeing them. Many of them weren't turning on their faces on Zoom. And then I decided to carry it over into my practice in school, even though I was seeing my kids, and was really really moved by how important it was, how quickly of things that like even the kiddos who looked like they were okay, but then were willing to share things pretty quickly of like, I'm worried about this, or this is upsetting me, or also this is exciting and I wanted to share it. And so I'm then able to follow up that afternoon. I have them all on this Remind texting app and check in and be like, I saw that you were feeling overwhelmed today. I'm so sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can do to help? And it's small, but it's been really meaningful for my kids. And there's been both some like major impacts in supporting kiddos, and then also just the small things that they say of just being like, thank you for checking in, or thank you for asking. So it's a Google form with some emojis, takes my kids about a minute, but is really powerful, and is powerful too for us seeing trends. So if a kid is saying they're sad or upset multiple weeks in a row and saying that they're not looking forward to anything multiple weeks in a row, that's a red flag for me. And so I can then also use that to go talk with our social worker or our guidance counselors to see what other wraparound supports we can get for that kid so they don't slip through.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jess. I think that core work, those little details are the ones that really matter, right? To get students to express themselves and really elevate their voices, which they have so much to say and sometimes they just don't know how to say it. So that's awesome. Thank you so much. I want to answer Caitlin's question around the action guide, and is there a section around resources and recommendations for measurement and assessment on SEL interventions? That is a really great question. And the reminder that I'm going to link the resource here. I do believe there are, if you go to the building an SEL team and then the set and monitor goals, I believe there are a few protocols that educators can use and the team can use to assess different intervention and interventions for SEL. There are also at the bottom of the resource should be some resources around different ways to go about that as well. There's just a lot to dive into there, but I believe if you go to the building an SEL team, you'll find how to set goals and allow you some templates to measure that data in the assessments. So I hope that's helpful. If you have trouble finding it, just feel free to email me. My email is on the slide, obviously. We have 4 minutes, so happy to answer more questions or to allow you to just go off and do your thing, post all the teaching you all do. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful holiday season and that you get some own adult self-care in, some adult SEL in. It is essential. If we are not okay, then our students will not be okay and will not learn from us. So please take care and thank you so much.
And thank you. I'll just say thank you too. Thank you for all the fantastic questions and for coming on to a webinar and presentation and conversation after school. I know that's really hard. If anyone wants to reach out to me, I threw my contact information in the chat. But Ellie, thank you so much for letting me come share and talk and be in conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Jess. Really appreciate you all the time. And we did record this. We did have some technical difficulties, so we will put the recording together and make sure you get it in an email following up and is with the slides as well. So you have these resources at your disposal. I'll also add Jess's information so that you have that as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.